Thank you, everyone, and welcome back to the second half of our day one, SICSS-Howard Mathematica. We're discussing ethics. You all just came out of an extended period of time. Hopefully you got a break in there, maybe ate something, where we were discussing a case study. So by now you are probably very familiar with this case study, The Ethics of Using Hacked Data, Patreon's Data Hack and Academic Data Standards. Before we jump into our discussion, do we want to sort of briefly touch on the elements of the case study? There are a couple people who joined us late and did not have a chance to participate in this exercise. So could someone sort of jump in and we can do this together? We can piece it together. Talk about who are the players involved, what they did not do or find, the legal issues here, the decision, and what stood out for you, just to make sure that folks are caught up who are just joining us. So feel free to raise your hand if you just want to add an element. You don't have to do the full summary, but let's start it off. So does someone want to share sort of who was involved and what happened here?
I can give a quick synopsis. So
thank you, Todd.
So basically a group of researchers had wanted to use some data to understand kind of online support, like financial support for creatives and artists, and a site that does that is Patreon. And so they wanted to get a good sample of kind of like a non-convenient sample of like all the users on the site, and they had some ways to get a convenient sample, but it just wasn't going to be the data that they wanted. And it turned out that some hackers like got millions of records by hacking the Patreon site, and so the hackers now had the data that they wanted, and that would further their research. So the researchers were basically debating whether they should use the data, what are some of the like ethical implications of that. And then the rest of the article talked about different cases of journalists reporting out on some data that had been hacked. They mentioned like WikiLeaks, for example, and then kind of comparing and thinking about how that may or may not apply to research.
Thank you. Did I hear we have a visitor? Janera, did you want to introduce us to your little visitor?
So he walked away now. So
well, children and pets, everybody's welcome. So please feel free to spotlight yourself if you have a little visitor. We love to see them. Okay. All right, let's jump into our first question. So there were 5 questions you were presented with. Any group, anyone, welcome to raise your hand or just go ahead and unmute. And also multiple people from the same group are welcome. So the first question was, does the illegal nature of the data collected and the release of private data taint the data in the release that was already publicly available? So what happened in your group? What did you all have to say about our first question?
I can go. We basically said a few things, but we kind of made a distinction between the ethics of it and the kind of what I said was kind of a chain of custody sort of issue, and that maybe it has tainted the data, I guess, in an ethical sense, but in another sense, there's the question of, well, when they hacked it and then they took it and then they released it, what happened in the interim there? Is there's a possibility of them tampering with the data, doing anything with it. The researchers couldn't guarantee the integrity of the data, even if they did want to use it, because of the method by which it was obtained.
I had not thought about that. That's a really good point. But I think one thing that we discussed in my group is a point that I raised around the status quo and how things end up being illegal or sort of understood to be available publicly. And role that power plays in setting the stage right now in terms of what kind of information can be shared. So in the spaces that I work in, there's some information that is readily made available, and there's some that's very much hidden, and people with power, I think, control that information flow. And so seeing that something is not typically allowed to be shared doesn't on its face make me think that it would not be better if that were to be shared, or that we shouldn't be trying to move towards that. I think recently there's been a lot of legislation that has said, hey, the way that we had the laws about what should be shared is not good, and it protected a lot of people who were, causing abuses. And so I think seeing something is illegal does not necessarily make me think that it would not be good as a researcher to think about. And I think the case study made the great point that anybody who is a whistleblower is probably doing something that was technically illegal, under the policies of data sharing at that time. And so I think really thinking about how the data that was there became prohibited and the power dynamics that fed into that is important to think about whether you should feel very bad about the data, like circumventing those protections. In this case, I think it's maybe it's hard to make that argument here, but I also thought like maybe Patreon is being used to fund a bunch of like violent groups or white supremacists or what have you, and that information could actually be super important for protecting people in the community. So I think it's more complicated, and I don't see the law as like a objectively good standard. A lot of things that have been pretty horrible have been legal in the past, and a lot of things that would be just are illegal. So.
Well, in the group that I was in, we actually kind of touched on that a bit, because I feel like this case in particular is not enough for me to be able to make that argument. Like they had mentioned Edward Snowden, for example, and I was like, well, in that case, here you have a national security issue where, the government that is governing us is using our information in ways that we don't like, or surveilling us in ways that are perhaps unconstitutional. Or even like I mentioned the Apple case where it was leaked that there was planned obsolescence in all of their devices, in which case they had to come out and say, oh, well, if you give us $30 until December, we will replace your battery so that it doesn't malfunction the way that we planned it to. In which case, sure. But in this case, especially for something like Patreon, and granted, Patreon might be funding all kinds of white supremacists and everything. I don't know. But I don't think that this case is enough for me to justify this. I do think that there has to be some kind of ethical consideration, especially when you're talking about hacked information, because sometimes, especially depending on what you're using this data for, right? And what the research is trying to say, that could have all kinds of wide-ranging implications on you and your career as an academic, especially. Like that might have, that might impact, your job, like that might impact your fellowship. That might also, like just coming from a forensic standpoint, where it's no longer just about whether or not you are right or wrong, or whether or not this is justified or not. You have a cross-examining attorney who is trying to get you out by hook or by crook. Does not matter whether what you have to say is relevant or correct. Finding out that you get this data via illicit means perhaps is immediately going to throw shade on your entire analysis that perhaps this person who's on death row is waiting for, and now you're kicked out of the room. And last thing, I know I've been going on for a minute. Also, like in addition to having that whole thing kind of be thrown out, you also have the issue of there are alternatives. There are alternatives. If the information that you're already looking for was part of this that was released and everything, but if that part of the information that you're already looking for is already public, just go get it from somebody else. There's just so many rivers to cross before we have to get here. It just, for me, seems like a can of worms for a question that doesn't seem important enough to open this can, for me.
Hi.
Hi.
This is Atlas. I do have a comment in the meantime. Okay, so you can let mommy talk now. Okay, so Kimberly gave an excellent summary of our discussions. We were in the same group. Okay, buddy. But the only thing I wanted to add was that I thought it was interesting that, you know, the way that this case study was put together, that there wasn't more information about the research. From the little bit we got, you know, I think we could kind of guess, right? But I feel like if you're gonna do these ethical things, it would have been useful for them to at least try to justify the research a little bit.
Do we have thoughts about question 2 about expectations of privacy? Self-serving here, I study privacy and cybersecurity and such, so I love this case. Marissa, go ahead and jump in, and then I see Yesh.
Okay, so I'm also looking through our notes and stuff too. Expectations. All right, so as we talked about how as researchers, we really need to understand that people who use these platforms have an expectation of privacy, even if we know as researchers that, oh, well, it's online, it's public. A lot of Maxine really pointed out and pointed to that quote in the case study that just because it's there doesn't mean that we need to use it. Just because it's publicly available doesn't mean that we need to use it. So we have to understand as researchers that even the IRB has not caught up to understanding big data and applying their quote unquote rules. But just because there aren't quote unquote rules saying we can't use it, we need to make sure that we protect humans involved in this, specifically in the case of vulnerable communities, because by collecting data, and we as researchers, we have the power to aggregate, we have the power to analyze things beyond what other people may or may not be able to do. So as researchers, we have to understand that power that we have and our abilities that we have, and through collecting data, especially of people who have an expectation of privacy, we can put vulnerable populations in harm's way. And we use a few analogies. We talked about this in the context of Black Twitter, and we also talked about this in the context of LGBT communities, where if you as a researcher are trying to understand, well, how do these communities navigate and discuss things on Twitter or on Facebook or other forms of social media? Yes, they may do it in public spaces, but they have an expectation of privacy because this space that they have created is a counter-public. It's supposed to be a place where they have safety, a safe place and a safe space. And by making that information public, you can put vulnerable populations at risk, where we already know that these communities are being surveyed, and there's a lot of surveillance within these communities. So if we put their information out there under the guise that it's already public, now we put people in vulnerable communities at risk. We put people at risk of being sanctioned, whether it's employment, whether it's within their family, whether it's within other forms or places. So we have to think about that expectation. I use the analogy a lot, dating back to my time in one of my law classes in undergrad, about law of search and seizure, specifically one case that talks about the idea of expectation of privacy. And in this instance here, we had a person who went to use a phone booth and the phone booth was tapped. And they're like, well, I have an expectation for privacy because I walked into this phone booth. Yes, it's public, but I shut the door. And so, of course, law enforcement are like, well, you're in the public space, you should not have expectation of privacy. Well, by shutting that door, they're saying, even though I'm in a public space, I do believe that I should have a sense of privacy. And so that's how people operate within social media spaces, whether it's making their profile private or whether it's engaging in certain conversations, not engaging in others. They're setting up the expectation of privacy. And we as researchers, even if it's there in public for us to see, we have to respect that expectation of privacy and be careful of how we use publicly available data.
Yesh, you're up next, then Meredith, and then Maxine.
Thank you. And also shout out to Nanette's point about medical records, because in our group, I was always saying, every time in my brain, anytime an ethical question arises, I start thinking about medical terms, because often people assume that information is somehow less important because they think it's only like data or someone writing stuff, whereas medical, immediately the stakes go up. So for me, that kind of helps balance this out. And another thing regarding privacy specifically, in our group when we were talking, Abidin brought up this question that we all agree to the terms and conditions in the first step. Like we all say, I accept, and we give permission to the platform to use our information in whatever public capacity sometimes. And I think it is about time we go back and review what is in that terms and conditions, because nobody ever really reads all like 3 pages of the terms and conditions. But these companies get to escape some accountability because of the things that they're putting on this 3 pages. The question we need to ask is, what are they allowed to put on there? Like, is it okay that they put this on that terms and conditions in the first place? Because is that itself an ethical question of you asking a user to give that? Because in IRB, in the training that we take before we apply for IRBs, I saw there was a case study of a car company that delivered their clients like this big balloon saying, hey, you need to come in and replace your car part or you will die. So like they first sent out like 2 or 3 envelopes like saying, hey, come get your car checked, and people did not come. And someone got into a car crash and they sued the company saying, well, you did not tell me the importance of this car part. So from the next day, they started sending out these balloons. So they took the responsibility to share with the user the gravity of what they're accepting or the consequences. And we don't see that happening in social media. So those were 2 things that I wanted to bring up regarding privacy and users in this context.
So we have Meredith and then Maxine next. I also wanted to throw out there, as we think about how this data got out there, there are possibilities that this was accidental, but it's also possible that it was intentionally put out by a competitor or by the company. And how does that affect the way that we see this data? So Meredith, to that point or to another point, go ahead and jump in.
My point is more about logistical fallacies, and please forgive me if this has already been brought up. I had to step away at the beginning of the call, so I think the first comment I heard actually came from Janera. But the problem that I have as I read over this case study again and again is the way that we think about data and data that is being made publicly available, whether through hacking or through the creation of the way the data is collected and shared. The authors argue multiple times that this data is like a newspaper archive. And frankly, as a journalist, I am offended. I am really offended. This is nothing like a newspaper archive. A newspaper archive is a highly curated body of work that has gone through an editorial review process. It has gatekeepers in a sense that those individuals who are assigning stories, creating stories, selecting which stories to cover, there are all of these places where there are decisions being made about what information is going to be shared and in what capacity and for a specific purpose. Patreon data is nothing like that. This is data that is basically a set of financial transactions and cannot be equated in the same way. I was hoping this didn't come up, but it bothered me so badly, I guess I just had to get it off my chest. But really thinking through, beyond the richer questions of whether this is data that should be used or the so-called purity of the data, which I raised an issue about in our group, but just thinking through the logics of what we are talking about when we talk about different data sets and making sure that our analogies aren't horrible.
Maxine.
Those were excellent points, Meredith. We also talked about, the data, the accounts were meant to be private. They were expected to be private, but even if they were public, people still have they don't understand fully how their data are being used. Most people don't understand the extent to which their data are used and the consequences of their data being used. And so the fact that these accounts were private should be even more respected than if they were public, right? And then the other point that we had made was it's really sort of interesting and problematic that we don't think of online data as people. We kind of interact with data collected online the way that we interact with each other online, which is like we're a little bit meaner. We think we're interacting with accounts, not with people. And so I think that's often true of big data is we're collecting it and using it in a way that we think of as just like data from accounts and not from people. And so when we're dealing with data that was intended to be private and a private person's data, we should respect it as a private person's data.
So I'm hearing a lot on this privacy question, and I also think that Meredith did a beautiful job in helping us lean towards our third question, which has to do with scholars and journalists. So scholars and journalists share some functions in dealing with information and making it accessible to the public, but are the ethical considerations the same? If not, why not? And I know that Meredith is not the only one in the room with experience with or connection to journalism. So I'm excited to hear additional voices here in this space. Although Meredith, I welcome you back too. The floor is whomever wants it. Let's get our hands raised. We can also head into question 4 too, if folks feel like that is covered, or our 5th question about what you would do personally. So I will cede the floor. Let's see what emerges. Go ahead, Todd.
Sure. Our group struggled with question 4 on kind of who gets to decide the net public benefit to society. And I think we as a group actually veered into talking about things that are not off topic, but basically instead of discussing who gets to decide as researchers, we kind of went into who gets to decide as companies, who gets to decide as government or institution or bureaucracies. I was curious if that dynamic welled up in any of the other groups and if people had difficulty with this question in particular.
We also talked about I think in the back of everyone's mind or many people's minds, we're thinking about researchers in academic institutions because that's where we sit. But I think, yeah, that point about where you can be a researcher in government and then you will be constrained in different ways. Instead of just an IRB, like when I worked at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, I was not allowed to invest in certain things, right? To preclude conflicts of interest. There's an actual mission, and hopefully there's some feedback mechanism from society more broadly that you can integrate to say you should be doing different things or we need to invest more or less into this kind of thing. That is different. And I think the more sort of like, I think some questions need to be or are best done in that kind of environment where you're constrained more than just a free floating academic. I've heard people at my school say all sorts of crazy things, and I don't necessarily think that they would necessarily be, they're incentivized to be good stewards of whatever public good we're trying to create. And I think sometimes, hopefully, our government can be better set up for that. And because of that, those people also often get more access, right? More data access and things like that. There's a lot of responsibility that comes from that and constraint that comes with that. Those things go hand in hand. And I think they kind of should in that case. And even with journalists, I think journalists have, access in real ways that academics don't, right? If I'm at a political event or something and I pull out my school ID and a researcher pulls out their press credential, we are treated different and have different access. And I think also responsibilities are different as a result of that. So.
Rashan, go for it.
In our group, we discussed, well, I just wanted just to go back to question 1 and really thinking about the release of private data and the word like tainted, and thinking about like what's the repercussions of having tainted data. And so we really thought about while the data is tainted, what does that mean? And getting tenure, getting something published, and like how that has ramifications. And so yeah, so we really thought about like, so it's like this data that's publicly available, and then this thing happens, and then it becomes illegal, and then this kind of repercussion of that. The data is going to be what it is, but then what does that mean? You're working on a project for X amount of years with this data, and so is that time wasted? Like how to shift from or repackage it in a different way. So like what's the ramifications, and then how do you kind of like pivot this thing that you may you know, this publicly available data. So yeah, so that's something that we discussed in our group and grappled with. And so were we doing question, and then question 5, we really thought about like, yes, we would use the data, and it was very very situational, and as to when and why and how and what would be extracted from it.
So we'll hand it over to Regis, and I'm going to launch a quick anonymous poll too to find out if you would use the data personally. You would use the data. Yeah, I'm about to do that right now. Whoever, let's see if this poll works. I'm gonna try this. Let's see. Let's see. Can everybody see that? That may not work. My first time trying to do one of these. Regis, why don't you chat for a little bit? You had your hand up while I work on sending out this poll.
Oh, sure. I'll try to lengthen it so you have time.
There you go. Thank you.
No, we in our discussion, we got a little philosophical. That's probably my fault. But some of it is that, you know, when it comes to this question of who gets to decide, I think typically the process within, say, sociology, which is my field, is that, you know, it's the academics who get to decide whether or not this is for a net public benefit, but then that's very much constrained by our own interests that don't always necessarily align with, say, a public sort of interest. And that's one of the things that, like in George Mason, we have a public sociology program where we're kind of challenging ourselves to kind of think about it in that way. And so that's part of the reason why, for me, it's a complicated question, because you got to bring in a multi-stakeholders in order to be able to answer that question of who gets to decide. It's more a process question than a who gets to decide question. But at the same time, there's also, you know, they talk about public good and public benefit a lot, but, you know, there's pushback on that and say there's many different publics, and not all of them have the same interests. Not all of them, one thing that may benefit one public will not benefit another public. And so, you know, and then that brings it back to a process question as well. And yeah, I think that's all. I think, and you have the poll up, so I'm good. I can stop talking.
Thank you. We'll give Marissa the last word. If you have not voted in the poll, we only have 18 people right now. Let's see how, if people's opinions have changed since the discussion, and how confident you can be based on the discussion you have with your colleagues, whether they still agree with you. So I'm sorry, Meredith. Yeah, it's a binary. I'm sorry. All right, so Marissa gets the last word.
Yes, so I just wanted to comment on we'll add to the idea there's multiple parties involved. So my group had a similar conversation. So of course, our first thing we talked about was IRB. IRB is often the one who makes the decision. But as we know, however, a lot of unethical research is still being conducted. And we believe that it's like a lot of parties involved. One part is the public, because of course, when things come out after the fact or post hoc, there's a lot of public discussion and public uproar of like, how is this allowed? Why did this happen? And there are a lot of public discussions of the public benefit not being justified. But even though these parties are involved, the IRB is involved, the public is involved, there is a step one, and that step one should be within the researcher. As a researcher, we should have tough discussions of before we even, as we're creating the study, as we're thinking about our purpose and our purpose statement, even before we go to IRB, we as researchers should ask ourselves, why are we doing this research? Why is it important? What information does it add to the body of knowledge? And more importantly, what information does it add to society? And if those questions or those tough questions can't be answered, you shouldn't be doing the research anyway. We should focus on the public benefit, the benefits to society, not our own personal benefits of, oh, I got a publication, so therefore I should do this work. No, your research should be focused on what is this adding? Are these important questions that need to be answered that's going to have a public good and actually going to help out society in different areas and different domains? And if you can't have that conversation with yourself, then you should not be doing this study.
Thank you for a riveting discussion. I hope you all enjoyed the case study. Again, this is one of my favorites. I feel like it's a great way to kick off our week and our discussion of ethics, which will be interwoven across our entire time together. That closes the exercise. I will leave you with the poll results, which are, drum roll, your colleagues, one person didn't vote. That might be me, because I didn't vote, probably me. Who would personally use the data? A whopping 2 people said they would use the data, and 18 said no. So things may have changed slightly since your discussions. I thought there was one group who said, we're all going to say yes. So at least one person in that group changed their mind. So I'll end the poll there, and we'll spend a little bit of time. I'll share the results with you all. Well, we're going to do a brief debrief logistics before we close out for the day. If you have already done what is assigned for 3:45 to 4 o'clock, which is applying for access to the Fragile Families data for our Fragile Families Data Challenge. That's on our agenda for today from 3:45 to 4. Amanda, can you drop the link to our agenda in the chat box, just in case folks are on their phones, et cetera, or multitasking. So you need to do that today in order to participate in the challenge on Friday. You'll get access to the Fragile Families data set. If at 3:45, when we finish our logistics, you've already done that, you are free to go. Enjoy your day. A few things to close us out. I'd like to first thank all of our participants, everybody, for being fully engaged in the work today. Of course, our inspirational speaker, Dr. Bahia Mohammed, who opened our day. You'll see her and also Professor Terry Adams from time to time throughout the week, giving us inspiration to keep up with our perspiration. Our panelists, Jay, Demetrius, Malebo, and, oh, there's one more person. Who am I forgetting? Jay, Demetrius, Malebo, and Zanel from our panel on making the most, getting the most out of SICSS. You have their email addresses. Please reach out. They're amazing resources for collaboration. And also just, like I said, they're all pretty amazing scholars. I'd also like to thank our TAs who came this morning in order to do our first 9 a.m. R and Python office hours. We'll have people available every morning now from 9 to 10 and from 12 to 1 in an office hours room to do help with R and Python. That can be, hey, I can't download RStudio. Why? Help me. Oh my God, all the way to more complex questions. And we do have some folks with some fairly hefty and advanced R skills. We want to make sure you also benefit from that. So we do have professional data scientists who will be doing our office hours for R and Python all this week at those times, 9 and 12. That's now been added to our schedule. So I'm also going to remind you about our lunchtime discussion sign-up sheet. If you have not done that yet, we'll drop that in the chat box for you. Connected to our work today, we have folks coming in to talk about mass collaboration. So that's Wikidata, Wiki Education tomorrow. So talking about mass collaboration and also Wikidata. We have FactSpace West Africa and FakeNet AI who will be talking about data assurance and also journalism. So they could be fun to attend and or sign up to ask questions. We have a couple of organizations coming in to talk about negotiating access to data. So the California Policy Lab negotiates on behalf of academics to get access to government data. So if that's something you're interested in, they could be fun to talk to. We also have a member of the negotiating team from UC that got Excelsior to provide open access to a lot more academic articles than they had in the past, which is pretty interesting. So lots of really great talks. I'm going to continue sort of pumping those up to get you to think about going. You'll notice that those lunchtime talks are at the same time as our Python and our office hours. So both of those are optional. We are encouraging you to come to those lunchtime events. If you need a break, that's great too. We've asked a few people to sign up in order to come and ask questions to make sure that you know, folks that have invested their time to create videos for us and sort of connect with us, get the benefit of the presence and interest of a few people. So all the videos for our lunchtime talks have now been posted. So if you're signed up for a lunchtime talk, you can now watch the video at your leisure, write down your questions, and be ready to go. You're welcome to add your questions to our sheet in advance. You know, sometimes folks get sick, things come up. If you want to add your questions there, it's totally fine. I want to remind you about the consent form. So we'll drop that again in the chat box if you have not filled that out. All that means is that when you appear on screen, we're going to have to edit you out. So it might take us a little bit longer to put up our video. So please just, if it's not a big deal, please let us know. If it is a big deal, or if you just want to talk about it, come talk to us. So we want to make sure we are respecting the privacy, I study privacy, of people in this space. So much is asked of us more than others often. So we want to make sure we're respecting your wishes. Okay, so just let us know. And if you filled out the form or we've been in touch with a few people, please let us know if you have questions. I wanted to let you know, and this is a reaction to the panel earlier today about the benefit of notes. We have created a takeaway sheet for you with information from today. It is editable, so you're welcome to add your notes to it. We'll do that every day for you. It includes links to the different resources, anything our speakers have mentioned that you should read, code, all sorts of stuff. So we're going to give that to you and put that up on our page. So if you would like to add in your notes, so we have a larger record, a community record of this experience. We're going to start doing that for you. So Amanda, if you could drop the takeaway sheet in the chat box for us for today. We will have everyone add their comments, and we'll just you know, release all the comments and such at the end of the day, but that's there for you. Let's see, we've got just a couple more minutes left. I want to make a huge pitch for heading to our 90 Seconds of Fame room. Ava, recent graduate of Berkeley, lovely human being, is there and would love to hear what you thought about Praxis to Power, about today, about this case study, about you. Look, 90 seconds, you know, 15 minutes of fame, forget that, 90 seconds. She would love to interview you about good things. And you're welcome to write to her at any moment, go like, hey, Ava, I'm ready to talk. And she'll head over to the room with you and talk to you. So if anyone's willing to do that, please drop it in the chat box. I know Ava would appreciate it. And she can do it at other times during the day in breaks, but end of the day is a great time. We have one more introduction to do. We missed someone this morning, and I want to see if they're here. So Ibukan, are you here?
I am.
We are going to drop the directions for the introduction into the chat box for you to review. I'll give you a couple minutes, and I'll finish going over our end of the day logistics, and then we'll have you do your introduction since we haven't had a chance to meet you yet. Okay, so we'll give you 5 minutes, and while you do that, we're going to do our pulse survey. So it is what is it? I always forget. I should have this committed to memory now. It's like start, stop, continue, some combination of those 3 words, and also anything we need to know. So take 5 minutes, and let's get your thoughts on how things went today. What we should start doing, what we should stop doing, what we should continue doing, any extra things you want us to know, we'll drop that in the chat box. We do that at the end of every day and try to make some changes overnight. So ask and you shall receive. I don't have any puppies or gold cards over here I can give, but I can try my best with other things. So that's in the chat box. Take 5 minutes. After that, we will do an introduction from Ibukan. So it is 3:26. So we'll go to, what is that? 3:31.
It's asking for edit access or something.
Let's see. Hold on one second. So just go ahead and fill it out. It should keep, start, stop. Anything else you want to tell us? Is everybody having difficulty getting into it? Thank you. We also need to add Troy. Troy did not do an intro also. Great. Maxine got into the survey. Thank you. Keep, start, stop. That can be about the program. You can share, you can talk about your personal experiences, how you're doing. Let us know. Great. People are telling me they're finished. Fantastic. Amanda, can you drop our skill info survey in there too? For people that are finished, just a reminder, by close of business today, we need to get the skills and info survey done. So we make sure we get people appropriately allocated to groups over the next 5 days. I think Amanda already gave you that. Give you a couple more minutes on keep, start, stop. Thank you, Amanda.
Nanette?
Yes.
This is Jeremy.
Hi,
Quick question. Really love the takeaway sheet. Just wondering about the takeaway sheet. Is that going to be like housed somewhere, like in a Google folder?
It's going to be linked. It'll be linked to the website.
Okay, perfect.
Is that good? Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, that's perfect.
Amanda will do that by the end of the day. Great question. Thank you. Got another minute, and then we will have Ibukan and Troy introduce themselves. Then we're happy to hang out and answer questions if people have them. Okay. I'm seeing lots of eye contact, so I'm guessing most people are done. All right. So that as long as you have gone ahead and done the application to get Fragile Families data, that ends your time with us today. Unless anyone has questions, I'm happy to hang out and answer any questions or help people get organized if they want to do Slack channels for different topics or set up meeting rooms for things. But otherwise, you are absolutely free to go if you're all done for the day. Unmute and say goodbye, and feel free to head out if you don't have questions.
Thanks, Nanette. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye,
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. Bye. Have a great day, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you all for watching. For more information on SICSS-Howard Mathematica, visit our website, follow us on social media, and join our email list.